Hey everybody, so let's get back to it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so we're going to get into public policy. So there's been a history of discrimination when it comes to any kind of laws or policies that we talk about in this country. And it's something that we need to be reminded of sometimes, because sometimes we hear arguments that, well, this wasn't in the Constitution, it's not constitutional, it's not a law, you're breaking the law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as reasons to justify discrimination and inequality. But a reminder that slavery, the relocation and forced land removal, Jim Crow segregation, banned interracial marriage, immigration policies, anti-LGBTQ laws. On top of that, the abduction of children and placing them into schools of Indigenous kids. You're going to have the legal separation or essentially domestic violence that was legal. You're going to have all these things that have been legal across time and space in this country. So just because something is a law doesn't make it not feeding into and or a product of inequality. And so really when we talk through kind of how we talk about our public policies, our laws, our understandings of that, we really need to consider and have conversations about both the lineage of history that we have in this country of discrimination, and also how those things have informed and been informed throughout our legal documents, our juxtaposition, our Constitution itself, and how those things need to be continued to be critiqued in order to make sure that we don't continue to make laws that are unjust and or that we're continuing to reform things that are inaccurate or not representative and or discriminatory towards specific marginalized populations. So any kind of class law or social welfare system is going to disproportionately impact people of color, disproportionately impact women, disproportionately impact those with disabilities, and disproportionately end up affecting LGBTQ plus, especially LGBTQ plus youth that get displaced due to family separations or family disownments. And so anytime you have a vulnerable population that is economically vulnerable, they're going to then be vulnerable when social welfare systems are cut and or they are not funded properly, or they're not, or the rules for them get increasingly harder for people to meet, our standards harder for people to meet, and all of those things are going to impact specifically these groups more harshly, because those are some of the marginalized populations that are the most economically fragile. The poverty rate for one person in this country to be considered impoverished and to be considered someone who could use social services particularly are going to be $12,140 a year for one person, or $25,000 for a family of four. So just a reminder, I don't know about you, but rent is not cheap. And for most people, they can't find rent, especially for a family of four, for under $1,000 a month, which is already half of your budget to live on for a month. And also it impacts your ability to find rent, because you have to make three times the rent in order to be able to rent it, for them to be able to think that you have the financial stability to rent. So I don't know about you, but I sure as crap by myself couldn't live on $12,000 a year. I've done it. And that was back in, oh man, we're not going to talk about that, actually, how long ago that was. But it was definitely a period of time when even that was a struggle, and I had to take on second jobs, and I have a roommate in order to make that a possibility. On top of that, for the family of four, for someone to live off of $25,000 in this kind of an economy, with food prices going up the way they are, and for rent looking like what it does, it just becomes next to impossible. And I have an assignment, if you are interested, that a grad school professor did with one of his classes. And he specifically essentially just outlined, here is your budget, here are the things that you have to cover here, and then you had to look up the average in your state for all of these things and see how much that tallied up and see how different that was than the essentially the poverty rate and whether or not that was doable. And again, we tie in that poverty rate and our lack of ability to kind of like increase it or make those bars more sustainable or more actually more reasonable. We tie that to this idea of this bootstrap myth, which is this idea that as long as you keep working and as long as you work hard, you're going to make it in America. But that's just not necessarily the case for a large portion of our economically fragile individuals. If you're a parent, you can only work so many jobs because childcare only runs certain hours in the day. On top of that, you're going to have situations. I'm not entirely sure if you guys can see my screen freaking out, but for whatever reason, my screen is freaking out a little bit. But you like it requires you essentially to pull yourself out of whatever economic struggles you're in. But for a lot of people, there are hurdles. There are hurdles for any kind of person of color or any kind of queer person in our society, because those people inherently have disadvantages because employers outrightly will discriminate against those individuals or not hire them or not promote them, and women too, for that matter. And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about jobs in that chapter. Again, childcare, and there are so many other obstacles for mothers on top of having to pay healthcare for your family of four. That in of itself is going to take out so much of that $25,000 that the rest that you have to live on would be incredibly small. And again, you will notice that, especially in this country, we really like to hand out buyouts or corporate stipends to do things a specific way, to hire a specific amount of people, to be more economically friendly, to not produce a certain product or what have you. And we'll give out these welfare essentially, or these essentially welfare to the rich or to corporations because we have decided in this country, well, A, lobbying, that's why we do this. But B, we do this because we have decided in this country that essentially giving more money to corporations, giving more money to those at the top is going to somehow trickle down. That does not work. It's inherently, it's been proven time and time again that that is not successful because the money doesn't come down to more employees. It doesn't hire more people. What happens is they buy into stocks or they buy into other companies so that they can continue to grow their own wealth. That is the purpose of capitalism. Again, I have another lecture on that, which I will probably be doing here in the next week or so for another class that I will be working on and will post in here, but that probably won't be on here for another week or so, about specifically the wealth gap and how essentially why trickle-down economics does not work. So moving on, we're going to talk about the criminal justice system. And that essentially consists of laws, the court system, police, and the prison industrial complex. More people are incarcerated in this country than in any other country, period, full stop. Disproportionately, this is men of color, women of color, LGBTQ+ persons, and those impoverished. Disproportionately, the women in prisons are mothers. Drug offenses and are a big part of who makes up our prison population. Of the women that are in prisons, the two main things that get them into prison is sex work and or drug offenses. 80% of violent crimes are committed by men, and most female homicide perpetrators do so in the rank of self-defense. However, up until very recently, self-defense, even in the way of harsh domestic violence, does not get counted as self-defense. And even now, the laws are very stagnant, because if you kill somebody in self-defense while they are currently not acting out violence on you, it does not count as self-defense in most states. And women, once they become part essentially of the prison industrial complex. They end up with supervision. They end up with probations that are very inconsistent with the roles and expectations of women out of prison. So they don't necessarily adhere to understandings that you have to work jobs in order to keep roofs over your head for your kids. You have to meet certain social standards of ideas and expectations that the roles of women as caregivers as well. Prison itself causes a lot of distress. It's expensive. It's expensive to be in prison for especially impoverished people, because they still have families outside of prison. You're taking away at least one worker in the household. It's also violence against women within the prison system is rampant. It is incredibly high rates of violence, especially sexual violence. Violence is also a very big part of our younger populations and our juvie prison systems. I listed on here because the book talks about Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, but that is the actual book title. It is a pretty short book. It's one that I assign in another class that I have, and it's something that I would absolutely want to be a part of your reading list if you have one. It's absolutely worth the read. It's short, it's sweet, it's to the point, and I think that it's still of value even though it was written decades ago. Lastly, we're going to get into the military. So the military obviously has links to colonialism, imperialism, right? It is the way in which we have garnered different land. It's the way in which we have garnered and or taken away specific power structures of other cultures. It's the way in which we spread Western ideology and democracy to other cultures and other nation states. So there's obvious links within that to a large portion of the military is used specifically for colonialization and imperialism. Women and the military. So women play a number of roles when it comes to interactions with the military or being part of the military. They can be service members. They can be victims of wartime crimes. We're seeing a lot of that in current events. We're seeing a lot of that as Ukraine continues to make allegations, which are likely true, of rape and sexual assault and sexual violence from Russian officers, which is a war crime. And the UN is already holding hearings about that. However, its ability to really enforce any kind of consequence is going to come out of the countries and their ability to or willingness to get involved. It creates a lot of refugees, and the military itself creates a lot of refugees within other within the country that's getting invaded. You see, again, a lot of that in the Ukraine-Russian situation right now. You create a significant amount of survivors of violence, and that's whether you're in the military, whether you are a victim of war, whether you have, whether you're a refugee, no matter what you are in wartime, there is nothing but a bunch of survivors of violence that have a consistent amount of trauma, community trauma, sometimes sexual and physical trauma, that lead to a long-term need for consideration, accommodations, and accessibility of specific resources. Sex workers are akin to the military. We talked again about that a lot in previous lectures. And then nursing, and in both in the service and in case of VA hospitals, you're going to see a lot of women that work in these institutions. The military itself has a very masculine culture, and it has been for a long period of time segregated by gender, and it continues to be that in a lot of ways when it comes to training, when it comes to physical fitness entities, when it comes to any kind of housing, those kind of situations, except for in specific war areas. And even then, the housing or barracks still end up segregated. For a lot of our military history, it was segregated by race, and in some ways there are still histories of perpetual racism within the military. Sexual assault and harassment in the military is underreported, poorly handled, has little consequences for the perp, but a lot of, especially within their military career, consequences for the survivor, especially if they come out and actually report these things. This is an incredibly rampant problem, and it's something that's consistently been part of the Democratic social agenda when it comes to the military. Military has some really interesting policies concerning periods and menstruation during military service. It's been used as a rationale for why women can't be in the military, all the way up to trying to figure out how women are going to get in combat situations, are going to get feminine hygiene products, and whether or not that is considered a staple or something that is necessary. You see, especially with female military vets, but vets overall, you see a lot of homelessness, a lot of trauma, and that's related to military service, and a lack of ability for the VA hospitals to really keep up with the need for both physical and mental health services. You see a lot of homophobia and transphobia in the media or in the military. You're going to continue to see that as specific agendas are pushed within that. And again, because homophobia and transphobia are consistent within masculine culture, it makes sense that that would be present. We're going to talk through these last three little things real quick. Susan B. Anthony writes a constitutional argument, and this was essentially the speech she gave following her charges for voting as a female prior to females being allowed to vote, and she cast her vote anyway, and she acquired a fine and some service, and she wanted to take it all the way up to the Supreme Court. However, the charges were dropped so that that would not be a case, because they did not want to assess the legalities of females voting at that juncture. She has a strength in her statements. She's a boldness of voting anyway. She was determined, and she essentially said, what does a democratic act mean if representation is not there? Like, what does democracy mean if we're not being represented? The language in the Constitution is very masculine. They talk about the fact that it's men, it's property owners, right? It's talking specifically about male roles in society, specifically white males at this period of time. And she talks about women as a disenfranchised class. I'm going to read to you my favorite quote of the thing. It says, "The women, dissatisfied as they are with the form of government that enforces taxation without representation, that compels them to obey laws at which they have never been given their consent, that imprisons and hangs them without trial by a jury of their peers, that robs them in marriage of custody of their own persons, wages, and children, are this half of the people who are left wholly at the mercy of the other half, in direct violation of the spirit and the letter of the declarations of the framers of this government, every one of which is based on the immutable principles of equal rights to all." And again, what makes up we the people? So she was really questioning here why it was that women were not part of the constitutional argument and why it needs to change. And I found this really empowering and interesting, especially given the historical time period in which it comes from. You can also find some of Ida B. Wells' speeches. They're amazing as well. And they also provide a female of color's perspective. The speech from the Sweden's feminist leader, talking about foreign policy and essentially talking about feminist foreign policy essentially ensures rights, ensures and participation in the process of government, and its possible benefits. It has a lot of possible benefits when you're looking at creating these policies on food security, on lowering extremism, on bettering health education, etc. They said they used the 4 R's, which were reality check, essentially check and see what the reality is of your world and of your women as citizens. It talks about rights, promoting rights. It talks about promoting representation again, and then providing resources to make sure that these things can be accommodated, that can happen. They talk a lot about learning from each other. The Tanzanian example, talking about intellectual freedom is the cornerstone of democracy. Cherish it and protect it. And she was specifically talking to a large portion of students who were getting ready to graduate and move on to other jobs, which is why I think this is an important thing to read for you guys. She talks about social revolution in the sense that this is how you change it. This is how you need to make policy. This is how you change the world, right? And she talks about working together for real change, economic opportunity, human rights being an issue, and sustainable development being an issue, which we're going to get more into when we talk about the next chapter. And then the last one, what it feels to be on welfare. I think that this is incredibly relatable, especially for those of us who are from Kentucky, who are from rural Kentucky, who are from places and economic statuses that are not catered towards the middle or upper class. And being on welfare becomes a blame game. It becomes this idea assertion that these people are criminals, that they're lazy, and just a reminder, less percentage of people play the system in welfare than people who are in a high tax bracket actually try to get out of their taxes. So just a reminder that there's less people in the welfare system that try to play the system than there are that try to play the tax system in higher tax brackets. I love how she talks about her grandfather with this pride, this determination, because she talks about him as human, and not to mention that she talks about him as human in a positive light, as opposed to the depictions of those on welfare as being this very negative, very taxing situation. She talks about education as a means of escape. She talks about homelessness and the system, the social welfare system, specifically the child welfare system and the juvenile system, and how they're interconnected and how they have impacted her life and impacted her opportunities and chances. She talks about shelters, jobs, and resources and the ways in which they have impacted her life's chances. She talks about the Clinton's amendment and college for youth on their own. So essentially, for most people under the age of 26, you have to have your parents' income in order to fill out your FAFSA, in order to get your paperwork rolling, in order to go to college. However, there is an amendment to that allows college youth that have shown that they've been on their own for a certain period of time to not include their parents' income and or have their parents as part of the equation to acquire financial aid for college. And she talks about how the welfare system arguments gets pitted in this we versus them ideology. So this idea that there is either you are on welfare and it's those who don't that are against you, or vice versa, and that those people on welfare, those are them over there, and they're this, that, and the other negative thing that requires us to hold control over their ability to obtain resources. So I think these all really are getting at the idea that especially linking criminality and especially linking the influence of the state on economically disadvantaged, marginalized populations. And I think that your book really talks about this in a very effective way. If you want further discussions about any of these things or please check out the lecture I'll be doing on the economic wealth gap and trickle down economics that will be coming hopefully shortly. Thank you so much for being such an awesome class. And I cannot wait to do the next series of lectures on actual activism and the positive things that we want to elicit in the world.